F1 2020 is here, and just like previous games, feels great on a controller. The default settings will be suitable for most players. If you want to optimize your settings, however, I can help. Let's get started. Hey everyone, hope you're all doing well today. My name is PJ, and today we'll be going over the controller options in F1 2020. I'll be showing you what settings are available, how they all work, and provide my own, so that you can get the most out of your pad experience. If you ever have questions about F1 2020, sim racing, or you just want to hang out with a good community, I stream on Twitch every Friday. The link is in the description. Also, if this video helps you out and you want to see more, subscribe to the channel for future guides, but for now, let's get going. So here we are in the pause menu, and we're going to go over to preferences and down to controls, vibration and force feedback. It does exactly what it says. So we're going to come in here, you have a bunch of preset options already, and I've got my custom scheme down below. The presets, they are pretty solid for most people in terms of the button inputs here. So these are your default inputs for gear up, gear down, clutch, look forward, look back, replays, DRS, everything you need here. That's all default, and everything here is also default as well. And if you make any changes here, for example, you can, when you back out, you can save it as a new control scheme, so you can do all your changes right there. I've already done one here, which I'm going to show you mine and explain the options as I go through. Now the first thing I do, and you don't need to do this, but if you're used to a control scheme from other racing games, then you may want to consider it. I keep most of my buttons the same as default, however I change a few things. So for example, I change my gear up to be B because I'm used to that instead of using A. I'm using Xbox here, but this guide also works for PS4 and PC and Stadia as well. We go down here, I use standard gear down, I use standard clutch. The next camera, I have removed that button because I never change my camera anyway, and I've used that button for something else. Look forward, same thing. Look back, I have changed that to a left click. So that's just pushing the analog stick in on a standard controller, but I use an Elite controller and I use one of the back paddles, and that's a very quick way to look behind and then look forward again. And I found that so useful that I don't actually need the look left and the look right options when I'm racing. Replays and flashbacks, I have turned those off because I never use flashbacks anyway, and it frees up another button to do something else. DRS and pit limiter, they're default. The radio voice commands, I have put on the right bumper. The MFD is clicking the right stick. I don't use push to talk, in fact I don't use chat at all in multiplayer. I tend to, when I race online, I chat in Discord instead. And then the rest you don't need to worry about. Now the reason I left the look forward, back, left and right unassigned was I'm going to skip over 3 menus over here to the MFD shortcuts, because I've used these as actual shortcuts for various features. So this is something that instead of going through all of the MFD menus, you can just do it right here instead. So when I'm driving, I can flick the right stick up and it pushes up the fuel mix, or I can decrease the fuel mix by pushing it down. I can do the same here with the ERS. I may actually change that because F1 2020 has changed how ERS works. I may actually change that to be up and down on the differential instead, which will give me more control when I'm not using traction control. So this is the most important part, I feel, of the controller settings, and it's where you can really change the feel of a pad. So let's go through these one by one. The steering dead zone, this is the amount of steering movement needed to register any input in the controller. A large dead zone will mean there's a large amount of movement needed on your analog stick before it's detected as steering input. So for example, you would normally want to set this at 0 so that you have the full range of motion. However, if you've got an older controller or a damaged controller, you may find actually that when you move the left stick, as you look down here on the steering, like I'm just simulating this for example, I'm exaggerating it a little bit. So when I flick the stick and it returns to center, it's not actually returning to a 0 position, it's returning to a 3 or a 4. So what I need to do here is I need to go all the way up back to the steering dead zone, and then I need to move that up and then attempt the flick maneuver again until the effect disappears. And there, it's disappeared, and now it's all working fine. If you've got a brand new controller, you don't need to do this. If you've got an old controller, I would highly recommend checking it out. It's to stop you from accidentally steering on a straight. That's essentially what that does. Steering linearity is where you change the rate of sensitivity between the initial stick travel and the final stick travel. So what this means essentially is when you have it at 0, then 0% when you move the left stick will be 0% steering, and 100 will be 100, and everything scales evenly along that scale. The reason you might want to change this, however, is to take some of the edge off of the initial stick travel. You may find that even when you're moving in small movements on the default setting, the car steers quite a bit, which can in some scenarios be difficult to drive. So what you might want to do here is actually up this, and I would recommend upping it to 50%, so that this makes the final part of the stick travel pretty much go straight to full lock, which you will need in some scenarios anyway. The game does dampen the inputs at high speed so that you're not doing crazy understeering by rotating too much, which is something that can happen on a wheel. But on a pad, you don't need to worry about that, but you do still need to consider your initial travel. So when you're going through some sensitive high speed corners where you don't need a lot of steering, it can be hard to get the right amount of steering out of the analog stick because the degrees of rotation you have is very small. So by upping this, you have a greater sense of control over smaller steering movements. I wouldn't put it much higher than 50 to be fair. I would just leave it at 50 and then go to a track like Suzuka or go to a track like Azerbaijan or something like that, where you can just see what the effects are in gradual corners. The final sector of Azerbaijan would be a good test for this. The Suzuka S's would be a good test. Spa would be another good test, for example. You just get a feel for it after a while. Do maybe 5 or 6 laps on 0 and then another 5 or 6 on 50 and feel the difference. It may be subtle, you may not notice it at all, or you may have such a level of finesse over your controller that you'll feel a big difference. Saturation then is essentially the outside dead zone. So this will set how much of your stick range is 100% travel, and then it scales it accordingly. The reason you might want to do this is again the same reason for the initial dead zone. If you're not getting full range out of pushing the stick all the way, then you may have a broken controller, for example. By moving this down, then you will be able to get your 100% lock. I'm already getting 100% here because I take good care of my controller, so I don't need to actually do anything, but it is something to consider. The easiest way to consider dead zone and saturation is the dead zone is your inside dead zone and the saturation is your outside dead zone. So this affects the minimum amount that you get 0 travel in, and this affects the maximum amount you get 100% travel in. The settings for throttle and brake are essentially the same, only they're with triggers instead. So for the throttle dead zone, for example, let's say you rest your hands on the trigger here, like I'm doing. I'm going to just put it down there at 10, okay? And that's just where I sit on the trigger when I think I'm not driving. So I would up this until that's at 0, and that means I'm not accidentally pressing the throttle. And then when I drive, it's actually totally fine. Another reason again is if your controller is slightly worn or damaged and it may be accidentally pressing a trigger down all the time even when you're not physically touching it. Again, you just up this until your throttle input number there goes down to 0 and then you're totally fine. Same there for the brake, which is in fact more important because the brakes are so powerful in an F1 car that even a tiny bit of pressure will slow the car down quite a bit. So you want to make sure that you've got your dead zones right for those. Linearity, again, this is the same as the steering linearity, so this affects the rate and the ratio between the initial travel and the final travel on your trigger. So let's say, for example, you are constantly pressing it down, maybe at a small amount here, and you're finding that you're still spinning out. You may want to up this sensitivity setting because you're finding that if you're pressing it lightly and it's pressing it here at like 50% pressure, that's 50% throttle. What you may want to do instead is up the linearity setting so that it is now 30% throttle when you're pressing where you think you're pressing it lightly. And this basically means that you have finer control over the initial travel again. This is very important when you've got traction control turned off. It's something to consider there because you need very gradual throttle application as you go through. So here I'm getting very gradual all the way up to 100, and that should give me optimal grip when I'm coming out of a corner. For the brakes, absolutely same thing, only you're doing it for the brake instead of the throttle. And then the saturation is like we discussed with the steering, it's your outer zone. So for example, if you're pressing down on your brake and you're not getting full travel out of it, then that could mean, let's say for example, you've got a broken controller or you don't physically pull the trigger all the way with the way you grip your controller, then you may want to up this saturation until that goes to 100. So now when I press down, it'll always go to 100 and I don't need to worry about maximum braking. That gives me the full performance out of the brake pedal, which is very important. So the next thing we are looking at now are the vibration settings, and on a controller these are fairly simple to set up. On a wheel they tend to be more tailored. So first thing of course is that on or off, do you want vibration or not? I would highly recommend it because you get a lot of great feedback through your hands. It can help you catch slides, it can help you notice when the brakes are locking up, it can help you notice when you've got a puncture or anything like that. Things that you may not be able to see on screen, but you'll certainly feel them. And personally, I turned this all the way up because I want all the feeling in the world, and my Elite controller has pretty strong vibration motors anyway, so it feels great and I get much feedback from it. On-track effects are the vibration settings for when you're driving on the road, which is self-explanatory, but what this actually really affects are your tires. So for example, when you are braking and you're starting to push the limits of the grip of the front tires, the brake trigger will vibrate. This is something that is used on the Xbox One controller. On PS4 you may not get this. The vibration may be simulated elsewhere. It may be simulated through the normal rumble motors. So when you're braking, having this higher will mean that you'll be able to sense it more. And also when you're on the throttle and you're turning and the car is starting to get loose, you will feel that through the rumble motors. So an easy way to think about this in your head is the brake trigger is how the grip on the front of the car feels, and the rumble motors in the back of your hand feel like the back of the car. That's an easy way to decide that. Rumble strip effects, self-explanatory. As you go over a rumble strip, these will vibrate. Off-track effects, again, this is pretty self-explanatory. If you go on the grass or if you hit a wall or something like that, then this will vibrate wildly. I tend to put everything up to maximum because I like to get all that level of feedback and I can tell apart which is which. The last three settings, you essentially don't need to worry about these when you're playing on a controller because these are wheel settings and the menu is the same whether it's a wheel or a controller. So you can try these and they will do absolutely nothing by my understanding, because on a controller you don't have wheel rotation, you don't have wheel transfer. Understeer enhanced, that again is a wheel only feeling. If you want to try out what each of these settings do on the road, one thing you could try is set everything down to 0 and then turn them up to 100 one at a time on their own. So for example, if I turned everything off here and then I just turned on the on-track effects, then what I will notice are the sensations that are coming through the car with just this feedback enabled. And this is how I learned that it is affecting the tires essentially. It's affecting the brakes, it's affecting the throttle. That's what this affects really. What I would recommend is you drive with the defaults, go on time trial on a track that you like and are pretty good at, and just drive through with no assists ideally and get a feel for everything that way, and then change each setting one at a time and see what happens. Change your calibrations, make sure they're right. You will find that by getting your settings right, you will get a finer degree of control, which can give you an edge in some races, and especially in multiplayer where people tend to use a lot of default settings to begin with. So any edge in performance can lead to better results. If this video helped you out and you want to see more, check out the guides on the right to get started. Also, to get future guides as they release, you can subscribe to help the channel grow. Enjoy your new settings, have a great day, and good luck on track.